Welcome, everyone. We're delighted, as Brad has said, that you can join us for a fairly fast-paced overview of engagement, leadership development, succession, career planning, and coaching effectiveness. In fact, in the next hour, we're going to fix it all for you. We've got the magic foo-foo dust here. Well, obviously, there's lots to these topic areas, and in an hour, we're going to just scratch the surface. We've designed this for primarily people who are at the senior executive level, involved in learning and development, or HR and organization effectiveness, organization development. So we're coming at it from that perspective. Now, we know not everybody on the call is in that kind of role, so hopefully if you're not in that sort of role, you take away some pointers and tips and techniques that will help you in your own growth and development. So let's start with framing the issue, first of all, the growing talent gap. Now, what I'm about to show you are statistics that were compiled primarily by Zenger-Folkman. I'll explain a little bit later on, just a bit more background on them, but research is their forte, that is their expertise, and we'll see about how the research is underpinning what we're talking about here today. So they've pulled together some of these statistics on the talent gap. First of all, somewhere around 70% of executives have a real concern about bench strength. Almost 100% of organizations report some sort of leadership gap. So that's a very overwhelming number saying there is a gap. And 40% of those say they have a very severe, a very serious leadership gap. And somewhere around 2/3 of current senior management will be retiring by 2020, which of course is part of what drives that concern about the sort of leadership gap that exists. So we continue on and we take a look at how somewhere around 40% of the leaders that are hired from outside rather than brought in up through the organization are either pushed out, don't work out, or leave within 18 months of joining, which of course is a pretty high attrition rate. And the leadership shortages are something that somewhere around 60% of companies feel like they've got a serious leadership shortage that's really impeding their current performance. To top it off, 31% say developing leaders really is their largest talent development issue. So clearly, as we see from this short overview and look at some of the statistics, we've got a major issue here that needs to be addressed. And then when we overlay that background with work that was done by McKinsey organization, this was a major study that went out over 10 years. It was reported on in this book, Beyond Performance. There were something like 6,800 CEOs and senior executives, global executives involved in the study, 600 respondents from 500 organizations, plus they did a review of 900 books and articles from academic journals, so it's quite a comprehensive study. And here's, the first part of this is almost motherhood. Right? Who doesn't feel like leadership development is important? And based on what we've just seen, clearly it's critical. Here's the real gap. Here's the real challenge. Only 7% of all those people involved in the study feel like their organization is effectively developing their leaders. We got some problems, very clearly, and I'm sure that's part of the reason that you're here today, is you're feeling some of the pressures that we've just looked at, and maybe as well frustrated by the success or lack of it that you've experienced in trying to develop leaders. So I wish I could say we have the magic answers, but we certainly have, we think, some pretty key parts of the puzzle based on research and the work that we've been doing. Going to be taking a look at the evidence-based approaches. I've been mentioning research is the underpinning of a lot of what we're doing. So we'll look at an approach to leadership development that we're calling evidence-based leadership. We'll, in that, talk about good, bad, and extraordinary leadership. We'll then also be talking about developing individual contributors, and I'll explain a bit about how we use the term leadership in a very broad way. We'll as well be looking at ways to leverage and build strengths. which is one of the key differences in the approach and the kind of effectiveness that we've had with this approach. 360 feedback and assessment is part of the extraordinary leader and extraordinary performer approach that we'll be talking about. So we'll talk a bit about how this is quite different than maybe 360s that you've used in the past. A key element then of building strength, because the question becomes, well, how do you take a strength from good to great, is cross-training, and we'll take a look at that. Then we're going to switch gears, and in our last few minutes, well, not so much switch gears, I guess. We're going to build a little bit further in our last few minutes on coaching and some of the key elements to coaching and building a coaching culture. All right, so that's the drink from the fire hose. The thing that we always wrestle with in these kinds of webinars is whether to take one or two of those topic areas and go really deep, or whether to take a broader approach that cuts across all of them. And that's the approach that we're taking here today, is to give you a broad overview of these key topic areas. And then, of course, you can go down deeper in the website, in our website, or we'll be doing a follow-up. Brad will be following up with many people to go further around any of these topic areas. So let's jump in to a little more background on Zenger-Folkman and the connection here with Zenger-Folkman. My connection is through Jack Zenger. When Jack was head of Zenger-Miller back in the 80s and 90s, I was co-founder of a company called the Achieve Group, and we worked together in a very strong, close partnership. That company eventually became known as Achieve Global. And so Jack and I went our separate ways around the mid-90s, and by the late 90s, 2000 area, Jack had connected with Joe Folkman, who he had known for some years. Joe comes in with a very strong background in psychometrics, in measurement of psychological factors, and 360s and surveys is where he did his PhD years ago, and has written quite a lot about. And so Joe and Jack teamed up and started working on a book around 2001, 2002, and the book morphed into what you're going to be seeing more about today. In 2003, they formed Zenger-Folkman, the company, to start to really bring these revolutionary approaches to the field of leadership development. And using evidence, using a research-based approach was one of the key parts of that, which we'll be seeing. And they developed over time quite a comprehensive, integrated methodology, and we'll be getting some glimpses of that as we go along. They ended up publishing a number of books. The Extraordinary Leader was the first one, and then a series of other books and lots of other articles. Again, I'll touch on a little bit of this momentarily. So one of the things that really attracted me, and in our joining with Zenger-Folkman just over 2 years ago, was the strength-based approach. It's an area that I've had a long, deep interest in. I've followed for many, many years, and the thing I've always felt missing is exactly how do you do that? It's a great philosophy, it's a great methodology, a great approach, things like positive psychology, a field that I've been interested in a long time. How do you actually make it happen? And so that's what very much drew me into working with Zenger-Folkman. Here's a list of some of the clients Zenger-Folkman has worked with, and some of the clients in Canada that we've been working with over the last couple of years as well. So it's a partial list. There's a lot of very long-established, highly effective organizations who are at the forefront of leadership development that have been pioneering a lot of this work. And in fact, Kevin Wilde, who wrote a foreword to Zenger-Folkman's most recent book, How to Be Exceptional, talks here about how they have found over 10 years now of using these approaches at General Mills, and they're recognized as one of the top leadership development companies in the U.S., that they've found this to be a highly effective approach that really challenges conventional wisdom, but has had an enormous impact on engaging and improving performance throughout their organization. So you can get lots more information at from these books, The Extraordinary Leader and The Inspiring Leader. We're going to touch a bit more on some of the principles from The Extraordinary Coach, and the most recent one, How to Be Exceptional. One of the things I'll say before we jump into our next topic area is that a lot of this is about leadership as an action, not as a position. So we tend to be thinking here about leadership in the broader sense of how we influence, connect, change, deliver results, not necessarily just saying a leader being someone in that, that particular role. Okay, so evidence-based approach. Well, the research began, actually I'm going to step back one step, the need for this kind of approach. This is last week. I went on Amazon, I typed in leadership, got over 121,000 books with the word leadership in the title. There's probably many, many others. A number of my books on leadership don't have the word leadership in the title, but in fact are about leadership. If you type in the phrase leadership books in Google, you'll end up with a huge number of hits as well. So there's a lot of stuff on leadership. So what Jack and Joe set out to do was to take a look at all of that and figure out what are the behaviors that really make the biggest difference here. So they had 200,000 people in the original database. It's now up over 500,000, assessing 50,000 leaders, or 20,000 originally. It's now over 50,000. And they were contrasting the best to the worst leaders to figure out which behaviors make the biggest difference. Well, first of all, as we're going to see, they found that there is a strong correlation between leadership effectiveness and performance if you're focusing on the right competencies. And so the 16 competencies that we'll see momentarily emerged as being key to leadership. There were dozens, hundreds of competencies in the database. There's a lot of competency models around. But what really, really makes the difference became the key question. Well, you can get lots more on this if you're interested from The Extraordinary Leader or the more recent book or an article that Jack Joe wrote in Harvard Business Review a couple of years ago. But here are the competencies. So the center competency is character. And then we see 3 competencies around results, focusing on results, driving for results, leading change, interpersonal skills, or what some of you may think of as emotional intelligence kinds of skills, and personal capability. Those are the key competencies that emerged from this research. Well, I'm going to take you through next a real bit of a blur of slides here. So it's not really to show you the exact detail of it all, but just to give you the overall sense so you can see the trend. We have a lot of this kind of research and just showing you the overall trends. So for example, correlating employees that are thinking about quitting with how they assess the effectiveness of their leaders. So we see a clear trend here. Now again, it's if we're measuring the right competencies, we see this trend. If we're measuring competencies like showing up on time for meetings or things that don't really matter that much, you're not going to see this kind of trend. But when you're measuring the right things, you see this kind of trend. Or we think of it as often the tip of the iceberg because these are people who quit thinking about quitting and some of them actually leave. The bigger problem is those that think about quitting and stay. So here, for example, we have the same organization, same pay system, same benefits, same culture, but different leaders. And when you look at that, what you see is that very poor leaders have very low levels of satisfaction. We go to the middle part of our chart. So good leaders have pretty good impact. Extraordinary leaders, outstanding impact. Well, this trend continues in areas like safety, for example. We've been doing quite a bit of work in the last few years around safety, same sort of trend. A poor leader has a workplace that's 3.5 times less safe than an outstanding leader does. Or if we looked at customer satisfaction or sales or net income, or here's one I find particularly interesting, same organization, same pay systems, everything the same, only difference is the kind of leadership that's being provided. So the first bar here is, well, you couldn't pay me enough to work for that jerk, is that kind of feeling. And then we see mediocre or good leaders get some pretty good satisfaction with pay and job security. Outstanding leaders, maybe you've had the privilege sometime of working with a leader where it's almost like, boy, they pay me to do this? This is great to work here and be part of this team and just so exciting and energizing and fun every day. Well, that has to do with leadership. So there's a lot more statistics like that available that we can connect you to if it's something you're interested in to really build a case for the power of leadership. Let's take a look then at, again, leadership being broadly applied, in this case to individual contributors. Because as Peter Drucker so well put it years ago, he said that effective organizations are those that enable ordinary people to do extraordinary things. So what are the competencies for outstanding individual contributors? Well, they end up looking remarkably like the competencies we just saw for leaders. In fact, they are the same 16 competencies with slight changes in application. So for example, in the column on interpersonal skills, inspires others to high performance rather than motivating others is a bit of a slight change. But otherwise, it's pretty similar. So let's spend a few minutes just talking about how important is it that, how important are individual contributors? This might seem a bit like a blinding flash of the obvious, but when you take a look at, you hear these phrases all the time, our people are most important asset, our best assets right up and down the elevators every day, all of these kinds of phrases. What does that really mean? Well, if we think of leadership as an action, then clearly we want to build an organization full of leaders. We want leadership at all levels across the organization. Because ultimately, that's what determines the effectiveness of the organization. Again, pretty obvious, but really critical to remember that it's the people, the individual contributors, that are delivering what the organization is all about. And they then have a high impact on influencing up, out, across the organization, working with customers, etc. And they're very much the pool that we're drawing from for future leaders in the more hierarchical sense of moving up the organization. And so that pool and the strength of the team is determined by the strength of the individual members. Well, here's another chart that looks at how managers rate overall individual contributors' competencies. So this is where you see managers who have a very low rating of the individual contributors' effectiveness or competencies, their productivity as measured through a number of different objective means that have been factored into these studies over the years. The productivity is quite low. We go to the more middle of the chart, we see a little bit better productivity from those that are rated higher. But here's where we see enormous differences, particularly those last two deciles, where we've got outstanding competency leading to much higher levels of productivity. So hanging on to those people becomes absolutely critical. And more organizations are talking about being a magnet organization and hanging on to their best people. And they are very vulnerable. If we don't care for them well, then we are going to have a real retention issue, and it can create tremendous damage for an organization. So what is it that tends to hang on to them? Well, the sense of meaning, purpose, an opportunity for them to feel like they're growing and mastering, that they're feeling like they're treated with respect and dignity. These are studies after studies showing these are the kinds of things that have a major impact on retention, effectiveness, productivity, all of those kinds of factors. And so effective career or succession planning, I know a number of you on this call are very concerned about that, and the statistics we saw leading off shows just many organizations concerned about career and succession planning. By doing this effectively, we can really set expectations for everyone, or at least those that really want to progress. Of course, not everyone always does want to progress, but we can really set that expectation. We can provide pathways and methods for individual growth and development, which can have a huge impact on productivity, retention, etc. And we can elevate this then to being a high priority that is supported across the organization, particularly at the leadership level. And it really needs to start very early. That's something we're going to come back to, because we want to take the so-called non-leaders and help them become extraordinary performers. Well, we're just going to touch on one or two last quick points here. This is an area where we could certainly spend a lot more time, and in our Extraordinary Performer program we do go much deeper. One of the things we talk about there are the stages of contribution, or career ladders that are not management ladders. And so the first step of the ladder is just the fundamentals, the basics, getting up and running. The second step then is where we start to really develop some expertise. We start to really get some real value add happening there. And many career ladders tend to kind of stop there. But the organizations that are doing the most effective job of succession planning and career development planning tend to also go on to step 3, where they're providing guidance, coaching, mentoring, helping to and even having individual contributors involved in doing that, and having key individual contributors playing very vital roles in shaping the very future of the organization. So it's our contention, in fact, it's our experience, and we've done some research on how leadership development needs to start much sooner, maybe not quite at that age that you see there, but certainly needs to start sooner, because the average supervisor, from our research, doesn't really get any development for the first 9 years on the job. It's really very much sink or swim. And so if we can start much earlier, like a decade earlier, we're going to dramatically increase our bench strength and all the things that we've been talking about here, and start to get to the younger generations as well, because most training and development is not currently reaching out to younger generations and helping to develop them. And we also find that it takes up to 2 years for managers to develop an acceptable level of confidence in their new role. So all of this is arguing, of course, for the need for much earlier development, and particularly individual contributors before they're even in supervisory roles. All right, well, that's kind of background on what needs to be developed and who we ought to be developing. Let's now talk about what really sets apart our approaches from so much leadership development that's available and all those hundreds of thousands of books and models and so on, is how we leverage strengths. Typically, performance improvement to most people means fixing weaknesses, closing gaps, addressing issues, problems. You look at most competency models, and it's all about fixing those gaps. But Peter Drucker said it years ago in one of his early books, The Effective Executive, that we can't really build performance on weaknesses. We can only really build on strengths. He called it foolish and irresponsible to focus on weaknesses. It's a misuse of human resources, because it's really just a limitation and nothing else. Well, as I look back over my own books and my own work in leadership, I see that I fell into a lot of that trap, where it was looking at how can we fix gaps, build well-rounded leaders, when in fact we now have clear evidence that highly effective leaders aren't necessarily well-rounded, but they're really focused on building their strengths. There's a story that comes out of the positive psychology movement of a grade 7 teacher early in this work, who had an assignment for the class to take a piece of paper, put their name at the top of the piece of paper, and pass it around to everyone in the class. And each person added the strength that they felt that person brought to the class. And so one of the members, Ryan, went through this exercise, and it really had an impact on him. And as the story continues, about 10 years later, Ryan joined the U.S. Marines and was sent overseas, saw action, and unfortunately was killed in action. And so his body was brought back home, and he, at the funeral, the grade 7 teacher was there, and a lot of the others from the town. And one of the old classmates of Ryan came up to the teacher afterwards and said, you know, that was such a cool exercise. That had such an impact on him. Made such a difference for him. His mother actually overheard this conversation and just said, yeah, we got all his things back with his body and his wallet and all of his personal things. And inside the wallet, what do you think we found? Found the list from grade 7 of strengths. It really is something that we can hang on to, build on. But here's the key question. What if the teacher had asked them to write down weaknesses and improvement suggestions? Would that likely be in Ryan's wallet 10 years later? Probably not. And yet that's what we tend to focus on. Most performance reviews, most training needs analysis focus on fixing weaknesses rather than leveraging strengths. And what's the lingering effect of that? Well, as we're going to see, it's much less effective than helping individuals build strengths. Excuse me. So, for example, if we took a look at the typical approach was to evaluate our level of effectiveness, do a 360 or get feedback, look for strengths and weaknesses, create an action plan from those. That's a typical approach. So if I get a report that looks like this, where I'm kind of down the middle and across the competencies, and I'm doing okay but not great, so back to those effectiveness charts, I'm kind of in the middle of the charts of engagement and all the other things. How do I become a great leader, a strong leader? Well, if I focus on just a couple of weaker areas, we've got a lot of evidence to show that that doesn't really have much of an overall impact. In fact, Michael Peel here talks about how at Yale University, and we're working with a couple of different universities in Canada as well, focusing on strengths has a much different approach that has had a lot more impact. All you really have to do is to think back to some of the best leaders that you've known or best performers that you've ever worked with. What was it that made them so strong? Did they have any weaknesses? Well, of course, they're human. Most of them did. Were they above average on everything? Well, no, most typically not. But they had some profound strengths. We call them towering strengths that vastly overshadowed those weaker areas and helped propel them to a much higher level of effectiveness. Now, we're not suggesting ignore weaknesses. In this case, we see where if there is a fatal flaw, and we deliberately use that term, sounds harsh, but we use that term to distinguish it from just a regular weakness. If there's something that's really fatal to that person's effectiveness, a flaw in their leadership, we need to focus on that. And where there is a flaw like that, our research shows that less than about, well, it puts the individual in the 18th percentile when we have that kind of situation. Well, the good news from all of this work is when you look at the 16 competencies, you don't have to be good at everything. You don't have to be a superhero to be a great performer or leader. In fact, what we've seen time and again the database is now 500,000 assessments of 50,000 leaders, and this is what it keeps showing, is that if an individual has no profound strengths, nothing at the 90th percentile, they'll be roughly around the 34th percentile in their overall leadership effectiveness. But look at what happens when we add just one, when we take just one strength from good to great. It jumps to the 64th percentile. Two strengths, 72nd, and so on. We see this phenomenal multiplying effect, the halo effect, where if we have a couple of outstanding strengths, they pull everything else with it, and they change the overall perception people have of us and our effectiveness. And we have a lot of data. Companies like General Mills and Wells Fargo, and some of them that you saw on the list there earlier, have been down this road now for 8-10 years. And they've got a lot of data showing what happens when individuals go through this process and focus on weaknesses, despite being advised not to. They still focus on fixing weaknesses because it just bugs them. They want to get those up, versus building strengths. Well, here's the impact. The good news is focusing on weaknesses shows improvement. So individuals that do that and try to get better at the weaker areas do improve. The even better news is that those that focus on strengths have double the overall improvement. And we have some of our studies even showing triple. So anywhere from double to triple the overall impact. So clearly, there's a huge effect here of focusing on strengths. And I'll leave this section with the last word from one of Zenger-Folkman's clients, the Vascular Access Medical Devices Company, Bard Access Systems. And they've been down this road now for 5 or 6 years and have been really shifting the culture, especially around performance management and leadership, focusing on building strengths. And what Mary reports on here is that it really has been remarkable, that the energy that people now have for performance management is much different than it was in the past. And she asks the question, how many people can say, how many companies can say that performance appraisals is something both parties look forward to? Well, our experience is not many companies can say that. So, all right, how do we do that? How do we take strengths from good to great? Well, it starts with a really good, clear understanding of where we're currently at and appreciating the power of this short, simple phrase that a perception is all a leader has. Sometimes you hear leaders getting feedback or reading surveys maybe an organizational survey, engagement survey, and saying, well, that's just perception. That's not reality. Well, there is nothing else that a leader has. How the leader is being perceived is their reality. And that becomes the reality of how people respond to the leader. So that's step one. Step two is to recognize that self-perception or self-assessment is not terribly accurate. We've run a number of studies now, and Jack Zenger actually just wrote about this in one of his more recent Forbes columns. So another study looking at self-assessment versus the ratings coming in from others around us. And so what this shows is that when you correlate self-assessment against turnover, sales, absenteeism, engagement, safety, quality, etc., how accurate a predictor is self-assessment against those indicators. And it turns out, as you see here from all these groups, that it's half as accurate as all the other rater groups. The correlations are half as strong, and the variances are much, the predictability factors are much higher with the other rater groups. Well, that's one of the reasons why many organizations, in fact, over 85% of Fortune 500 organizations use 360 feedback as a way of trying to provide more balanced input, more balanced look at just where someone is at. And so it really does help give that information. The problem is, and we've run into a couple of situations over the last year or two in some organizations where 360s have been outright banned. The CEO or someone has said, we will not have those in our company anymore because they've had such painful experiences with them. Because we don't yet know about any other 360 tool currently available that is strength-based. Every 360 tool that we're aware of is weakness-based, is basically saying, here are the competencies that we built this tool around, here's the feedback on those competencies, and inevitably draws leaders into spending 5 minutes on their strengths and 55 minutes on their weaknesses. And so many people don't like the process, don't see much change occurring because of it. We'll take a look at a little bit later on at why that's the case. And it's really losing 70 to 80% of the training value. Now, where does that number come from? Well, it comes from what you're going to see a little bit later on, that when we build strengths, we have a much higher percentage of impact and long-term impact than when we build negatives or weaknesses. So many people, as a result, end up feeling beat up by 360s and feel punished by the process. And in some organizations, they're to be avoided. Now, if there's good coaching, or if an organization has handled the process well, they can mitigate some of that, but it still doesn't have nearly the impact that focusing on strengths does. So let's take a look at how this came to be designed. This is drawing from Joe's background and his work with 360s. He's been working with 360s pretty well all of his career, which goes back quite a few decades now. And he's been involved in developing hundreds of different 360 tools, assessments, customizing them, researching them, etc. So what I'm going to show you now, there is a white paper available that can give you a lot more depth on all these points. And some of this is summarizing what we've already covered, and some is going to look at a bit of what's to come. But what do we see is the difference with the 360 approach we're using here? Well, first of all, it's very simple. It takes about 15 or 20 minutes to complete. We know of some 360s it can take you an hour to wade your way through 100 survey questions or 75 survey questions or some ridiculous volume of behaviors and survey items. It's comparing to extraordinary, because we're shooting for extraordinary here, not just averages or norms. We're going for the 90th percentile. So we're providing data at the 75th and the 90th percentile. So an individual can see where they're at. Its strength is 75th, extraordinary strength is the 90th. And it is as well taking us to scales that are a little different than the typical one. Here's a typical scale, 5-point Likert scale. If I'm assessing somebody on do they listen carefully and attentively, I'd say, yeah, I think they do pretty good, so I give them a 4. So the participant looks at that and says, hey, I got a 4 or 5, not too bad. If we look at the strength to improvement scale or the strength-based scale that we use, you can see that 4 is a strength, 5 is outstanding, 3 is competent. So now I'm getting a 3. Well, that seems like I'm being punished, but what it's really doing is separating more clearly a strength from a competence, or just doing okay. Because most surveys, and those of you who've been involved in surveys know that you often get this banding around the 4 on the scale without a great deal of distinction. So we've talked about some of these next points. We've talked about performance outcomes and how we measure against that. We've talked about building strengths, how key that is. We want to really make sure that we're getting to the competencies that are most important to the leader's role. So that's one of the questions we ask in this 360, is which competencies matter for this leader, not just for the position or level of the organization, but for this individual leader. Written comments don't ask for weaknesses. All we care about is, are there any fatal flaws? We don't want a list of weaker areas. It's not helpful. It diverts attention away and starts to make this feel like you're going to get beat up. It takes 15, 20 minutes to complete. The reports are quite intuitive and visual and can provide some real insights into how leaders can build their strengths. And that last point is where we jump over into, so how do you do that? How do you build your strengths? How do you take this report and figure out how to take strengths from good to great? Well, to do that, we use an approach called cross-training, which Dee Thomas here at Boeing has identified as one of the key elements in improving their overall employee commitment scores and helping even their poorest leaders get better, but their best leaders get even better, or better leaders get higher. And it was a major impact in their winning the Malcolm Baldrige Award. So it starts with helping leaders determine which strengths are key, and that we do 3 things with that. One is, is it a strength? So is it at the 75th percentile or so? Is it something that's important to the role? And is it something the individual has passion about? Where those 3 things intersect, we end up with a sweet spot. And that allows us to move into a cross-training kind of approach. And so once we've identified what to work on, then how do we go to work on it? Well, building around that strength is how we go to work on that. So we use an example here, a long-distance runner. To tell them just go run more is not going to be horribly effective, might even injure them. So world-class athletes, elite-level athletes, to get even further, to get to the Olympics, let's say, do a variety of cross-connected or cross-training kinds of activities. So what we have done is built a similar connection through research for every one of the competencies. So here's an example of one. Here we have honesty and integrity. So I get a feedback report, and it says, I'm at the 75th percentile, but I'm saying, well, but I don't lie, cheat, or steal. I think I'm character strong. Why am I not higher than that? And how do I get higher? Well, is it that I'm just going to I'm going to make a resolution, always be honest. I'm going to never lie. I'm going to be really, really, really honest. How do I get there to that higher level? Well, what we've done is gone and looked at people who are scored at the 95th percentile all the time. Where are they? And what we see is this kind of correlation, that those at the 90th percentile have high scores in some or many of these other cross-connected competencies or behaviors. So for each competency, we have a chart like that. This is actually a screenshot right out of the workbook showing the one for communicates powerfully and prolifically. And it allows the individual then, going back to that earlier sweet spot chart, to say, well, where's my passion? What's the need for my role? And where's the strength for me? That will then be where I'm going to focus. How do I build on that strength? Well, now I can pick a couple of these cross-connected competencies and build on those from there. This kind of approach is why we have feedback from companies like Jet Propulsion Labs, who literally are rocket scientists, who have said that this has had a major impact for them using this cross-training approach to providing a more science-based roadmap or methodology for going from good to great. Again, lots more information is available. Brad is happy to talk to you further about this approach. We're just skimming very briefly or giving you that drink out of the fire hose here. And we're going to do that in the last few minutes around coaching. To switch metaphors, I'm going to kind of skip over the icebergs here in 6 steps of developing extraordinary coaching skills. Let's set up the problem first of all. The problem is that a lot of managers think they're doing a pretty good job with coaching. Many surveys, this is one from a large client of ours in the telecom business, managers rated themselves pretty high on coaching. Then we ask those reporting to the managers, how much coaching do you get? How effective is it? And we get the opposite happening. And this gap shows up time and again. And in fact, there's a lot more discussion of this in what I think is an outstanding book on coaching. In fact, I gave it a rave review long before I had this partnership with Zenger Folkman a few years ago in one of my blogs, because I think it's by far the best book on coaching that I've ever read for its practical insights, its research, and just how well written it is. So looking at what are some of the key elements to effective coaching, well, first of all is defining what it is and what it isn't. And I found this chart extremely helpful to distinguish between training, which is valuable, and we need to do lots of that, mentoring, which is where a more senior person conveys knowledge and provides guidance, and coaching, which is a lot more like facilitating or drawing out or bringing together both the coach and the coachee's awareness and understanding and arriving at this kind of place where we're expanding awareness, we're coming up with superior solutions together, and we're making and implementing better decisions. One of the things I love about running these coaching workshops is that inevitably when people come with their real situations to the workshop, we end up going to a different place than any of us foresaw. So we tend to apply that in 2 ways, for performance situations, performance coaching, and for career coaching. So how can we build extraordinary coaching like extraordinary leadership? Well, we find, once again, helping people understand the enormous payoff of coaching effectiveness is key. We can reach back into our database. In this specific case for coaching skill set, it started with 250,000 raters of roughly 25,000 leaders or coaches. And we see a similar correlation to what we saw earlier. Highly effective coaches reduce dramatically people who are thinking about quitting. They increase dramatically. Once again, we see this huge, in fact, it's even sharper increase here between employees' commitment and the level of coaching that they receive. The kind of how people will go the extra mile. We see this is a specific question being asked in the survey. Are employees willing to go the extra mile? And we correlate that against the kind of coaching effectiveness they feel that they receive. And once again, especially look at those last 2 bars. Huge differences. I mean, the differences between bad coaching and good coaching, fairly significant. But the differences between good coaching and outstanding coaching is quite significant. So using, again, we have a lot of this kind of information available. There's a white paper you might want to ask Brad for or take a look on our website for that is called Bringing Science to the Art of Coaching, that brings in more of this kind of research and shows more of these sorts of connections. So let's go on to how do we build strong coaching skills. Well, again, a big iceberg here that we'll just skip over top very quickly. Having a framework makes an enormous amount of difference, because one of the problems that many managers fall into, and one of the reasons why they're often not rated very highly as a coach, is because they don't really prepare or go into coaching conversations, even if they're on the fly in the hallway, with any sort of framework or a preparation ahead of time. And often as well, make it more about the coach or the manager than about what is it that the coachee wants to get from this overall conversation. And subsequently, and this all starts to connect together, they spend way too much time telling, advising, and taking up a lot of airtime. We use a little acronym in our program called WAIT, W-A-I-T. Why am I talking? What's exactly the reason for my talking right now? And am I just giving advice, which is training or mentoring? It's not coaching, as we defined it earlier. So we give advice way too early. we don't explore all of the different alternatives, and we don't really probe down deeper into the coachee, which is kind of like back to the second point on this list, the coachee's commitment to change, and really understanding and making sure that that commitment is strong. And lastly, then, we end up oftentimes with very poor follow-up and accountability, or when we do follow up, it's, well, how's my action plan working out for you? How's my approach working for you? Well, for most people, somebody else's plan doesn't work so well for them. It needs to be their own plan. So with structure, what we see is a lot more consistency. It's a lot more effective kind of conversation, and quality, we've measured this, clearly improves. Without structure, we end up with managers think that they're coaching, but employees really don't, the problem we started off with a few minutes ago. Confidence of both parties tends to decrease in the whole process, and it's very easy to just revert back to, all right, let me just tell you how it is. This is the way it's going to be, or this is what I want you to do, and to revert right back to previous methods of coaching. So we use a 4-step framework. The entire book, Extraordinary Coach, our entire program, is built around these 4 steps. The F being framing or focusing the conversation. What do we want to get from this? What do you want to get from this? Understanding the current state. Here's where listening and probing and good open-ended versus closed-ended questions become critical. And many managers don't really understand or appreciate the difference between a question that's really an advice wrapped in a question and a true open-ended question. Exploring the desired state. What is it that the coachee especially wants to see? It does the coachee own and is engaged in this, or is it me as the coach or as the manager trying to push my vision onto this individual, which then means that their chances of following up on the success plan that we put together, well, once again, it's going to be my plan for you rather than the plan that you grab hold of and really feel like you want to make happen. So we have a couple of tools to help with that, and which is all part of this process. Some ways of framing each step in this whole process. So a lot of this is built on science and a good deep amount of research, which again you can look at further in the resources we've talked about. And let's just take a quick look at what some of that science is. The competencies for coaching, in the 2-day version of our Extraordinary Coach program, there is a 360 available so that the coach or the manager can get feedback on his or her skills or competencies specific to coaching. And that's come out of the research of what is it that extraordinary coaches do. Well, here are the 14 competencies. So there are 4 around relationships. There's a series of competencies here, 5 of them around communication, which you can see is 2-way communication. Action and results, making it happen, is another set of competencies, and following up, following through, ongoing support. So the approaches that we're talking about here come from that, and they come from learning from other disciplines. For us, for most of us, coaching is a tool to help organizations be more effective. But for many professions like counseling, social work, psychology, psychotherapy, etc., it is the reason that the field exists, or the reason that coaching or counseling is why they're there. And so there's a lot to be learned from that. So we looked at that, kind of pulling it all together to say, well, we have these coaching competencies, we have other research, brain research, change research, etc., but especially motivational interviewing research, which is some of this learning from other fields. And so, for example, treating this whole discussion and conversation as a collaboration, adult to adult, turns out to be absolutely critical, where the helper, the coach, the counselor is trying to draw out and help build ownership for the coachee rather than trying to educate them, because we're trying to maintain their autonomy and have their, again, ownership to follow this through. Well, let's move on to our last 2 steps here in this quick skip across the icebergs. So skill development is obviously key to all of this. How do we help people, and managers especially, build the skills of moving out of this trap which is where the employee complains or says there's an issue or problem. This is now especially specific to performance coaching. Hey, boss, got a problem, need some help with whatever. The manager typically then will take that and run off and either give advice or take the issue, take the monkey on their back, to use that old analogy. Whereas what we're trying to build here is a skill set that is using the approaches we've just talked through to use good questioning, build a sense of ownership and empowerment on the part of the employee, so that the employee then comes up with a solution, assesses what makes most sense for them and the risks perhaps that they're taking, and then moves out from there. Well, what we've found is that there's some unique challenges then in building those kinds of coaching skills. One is helping people to unlearn. Can you empty your cup? The old Zen parable of the Zen master filling up the cup and keep filling it and it's overflowing, and someone saying, whoa, wait a minute, my cup is full, don't keep trying to put it in there. Well, sometimes we approach this already knowing what coaching is or feeling like we've got it, and maybe we need to really empty the cup and do some unlearning. So we also find, back to that first chart I showed you about training, mentoring, and coaching, that a lot of leaders are really talking about training and mentoring, which is perfectly legitimate, but it's not coaching as we're talking about coaching here. And that's often colored by the role of coaching in sports, where a coach gives direction from the sideline, and some elements are similar to what we've covered here, where the coach doesn't touch the ball. But the misleading parts are the giving advice, because a good sports coach will give advice and will point out what needs to change or improve or reinforce, and that makes lots of sense in that setting, because that coach has more wisdom, expertise, and is coaching in the sense of really mentoring or training. We're not exploring together how to be more effective. And so learning how to do that in a more effective way, we found, is key to good skill development. Well, our last part I've really covered already. It's just a way of summarizing some of what's been woven through the other steps. But it's empowering and encouraging coachees to look for coaching, because that'll help it to increase, to make it a two-way street, an adult-to-adult kind of conversation, and to find ways to make coaching available to everybody across the organization, individual contributors, high-potential programs, to bring those sorts of coaching skills and coaching know-how into those sorts of situations. So, for example, here's one example of one tool that we've used, which is to have the coachee identify, where is it that I would like to get more coaching? Maybe it's around my career, maybe it's around specific issues that I'm facing, but having the coachee own the process is a key part of strengthening that coaching collaboration. Well, I've just taken you on a very quick tour through the key elements of coaching, which was even shorter than the tour I've given you of the building strengths for leaders and for individual contributors. As I said at the outset, this is a drink from the fire hose, and we chose to go broad and across a number of areas rather than deep into any one, but we're happy to follow through with you to go deeper, or we'll direct you to a couple of places and upcoming events that will help you go much, much deeper. So, for example, those of you in the Toronto area, we're in Mississauga, which is right by the Toronto airport. The morning of the 28th, Brad and I will be hosting an executive briefing. It's complimentary. There's no charge for it. And you can get lots more information on our website and register on our website for that. And that's essentially what I'll be doing, is spending a lot more time, and we'll have more interaction and discussion around what I've just covered here over this last 55 minutes. We'll go much deeper into that. We also have Extraordinary Leader and Extraordinary Coach workshops coming up. You can go through either one or both. They are being offered back-to-back, so if you want to stay for 2 days and go through both of them, you can. In, say, Vancouver, we're going to be there. I'll be doing these sessions, so I'll be there December 1st and 2nd in Vancouver. Then we'll be going on to Edmonton, fly on to Edmonton that night, and I'll be there in Edmonton on the 3rd and the 4th. So December 1st and 3rd will be the extraordinary leader. The 2nd and 4th will be the coach. Again, you can do both of them together. They complement and link together very well, or you can do them independently. We also are running the same 2 workshops on the 10th and the 11th in Mississauga, and we've added one other workshop in Mississauga, which is on the 12th, the extraordinary performer. Now, it's highly unlikely that someone would go through all 3, because essentially what the extraordinary performer is very similar to the extraordinary leader, except it's focused on people who aren't in leadership roles, and they get what we sometimes call a 270 rather than a 360. 360, you're getting input from your direct reports as a leader. As a performer, you don't have direct reports, and so you're not getting that input. Plus, we've added some other elements about stages of the career model. There's a few things that are just a little bit different, but the basic methodology, the 360, the use of strengths-based approaches, etc., are very, very similar. So lots more information on our website for that. The briefing, just like this webinar, is in Mississauga, is primarily aimed at these groups of people. And I'll close by inviting you to complete our feedback form, which we'll be sending out following this broadcast, for a chance to win a complimentary or free copy of both of these books that we'll be doing a draw for. And we'll also include in that follow-up links for articles, white papers, blogs, etc., as well as links to archived webinars, including this one. So let me wrap up with one last thought from Peter Drucker, who really was way ahead of his time. When back in the 60s, he wrote an entire chapter in one of his books on strengths, and it's taken us 40 or 50 years to catch up with research and methodology now to really put some good, strong framework and approaches around what Drucker said. He talks here about how the effective executive makes strengths productive. You really can't build on weaknesses. That strengths are the real opportunities, and that if we strengthen our strengths, really build our strengths, we can tower over the weaker areas, unless it's a fatal flaw. That's always the caveat. But if it's not a fatal flaw, we can tower over those weaker areas and make them irrelevant, or it's not what people really see. They see the strengths. And that's what feeds the opportunities and can help to starve the problems. Well, thank you for joining us. Hopefully you did take away lots of food for thought here, and we look forward to following up and talking further about how we might be able to help you build or close that talent gap in your organization.